Muito bom. Hã? Ah, sei.
Ela vai avisar quando começa a transmissão.
Muito bom. Bom, então estão abertos os trabalhos em inglês. We are opening the works of the 5th workshop on new developmentalism. It is a very good thing that you can have this workshop now, mostly presential, and in this to this workshop we have a special invited, that's Robert Wade, and when I speak about the history or how new developmentalism emerged, I say that it emerged naturally from classical developmentalism. That is a theory that began to be developed in the 50s. Actually, the first founding papers is from the 40s, on the big push. But when arrives the 70s and especially the 80s, this theory comes to a crisis. Neoclassical economics becomes dominant. The World Bank, that was a hub of developmentalists, turns into the hub or neoclassical of the neoliberal reforms. A disaster. And in this disaster appear 3 books in the 80s, still in 1990, because in 1982 there was a book by Chalmers Johnson on Japan. Then in 1999, a book on South Korea by Alice Amsden. And in 1990, a book by Robert Wade on Taiwan. And I used to say that these 3 authors, with these 3 books, they began a second generation of new developmentalists, not the new developmentalists. Was to a certain extent, classical developmentalism was reborn with this and the contribution of several economists, but I used to emphasize the works of Eric Reinert, Hajun Shank, e Gabriel Palma. The first 2 authors, they are not also historians, not theoreticals. What they did essentially was very interesting. Both was to show that the reforms, the policy space of the developing countries that had been strongly reduced by the neoliberals. This policy space, all the developmental policies that we used in Brazil, for instance, but in many countries, these were condemned. No? But they showed, these 2 economists showed that were exactly the institutions and the policies that the rich countries adopted in their time. After that, new classical developmentalism has known a renaissance to a certain extent, and the key idea was industrial policy. Industrial policy that we in classical development, I am the only one here that of this time, of the first generation of classical developmentalism. This expression, industrial policy, didn't exist. We spoke about economic planning. If you want, indicative economic planning sometimes, but economic planning. Now was industrial policy, and it was something important. New developmentalism was born in the early 2000s, when I arrived to the conclusion that nevertheless the classical developmentalism theories were not sufficient to face the crisis that had begun, especially in Latin America, a crisis that began in the 80s, and in the 80s its causes were very clear, were the big foreign debt crisis, a crisis that resulted from the military regime's decision to grow with foreign savings, naturally with happiness and pressure from the north. And in the case of Brazil, also of Argentina, and the others not so much, of high inflation. But in the early 90s, this was resolved. In the case of Brazil, high inflation in 1994. And we hoped that inflation, that growth would recover, and didn't. Recovered a little, yes, it was not fully stagnant, the economy, but a very low growth, a quasi-stagnation followed. And was looking at that in 2000, in the early 2000s, I and a group of economists, among which José Luis Oreiro and Nelson Marconi, to my side, we began to develop this new developmentalism theory. Well, this is a small presentation of the workshop. We are going to have this workshop today, and is being will be in YouTube, the works of today, and tomorrow we'll have the discussion of the papers in 3 panels. Would you like to say a few words?
Good morning. Thanks for everybody that came or are attending in the YouTube, our seminar in YouTube. Bresser introduced the general guide of the seminar. We have a class in this morning, the class from Professor Bresser, my classes. In the afternoon, we have the class from Professor Oreiro, and at the afternoon, not in the evening, but at 5 o'clock, we have the speech, the lecture of Professor Wade. Tomorrow morning, we also have another speech from Professor Wade at 9. And then at 10:30, we start the round tables to discuss the papers that you present, okay? It's a pleasure to receive you here. I hope you enjoy. And I just want to say thank you for FAPESP and for INET that both are supporting this workshop. And then later, Thiago will say some words about INET also, okay, in the general work of the general activity of INET and the kind of support that they gave in general, okay? So welcome, and then you can start to the seminar. Thank you.
You want to say?
Yes.
Well, good morning for everyone. It's a pleasure to be here again after almost 3 years because of the pandemics of COVID-19. I just want to speak a few words about a recent experience that I have and that maybe have some relationship with this workshop. Recently, I was invited by the Indian government for a conference at New Delhi called the Kautilya Economic Conclave. Well, I am the only Latin American delegate at the conference, which means that Latin America is losing its importance in the global economy. Well, and this is occurring basically because we had abandoned the developmentalism. We have changed developmentalism by neoliberalism and the thesis of the Washington Consensus. So all the talks that I see at the conference in New Delhi, including the one made by the chairman of the Central Bank of India and the Madam Minister of Finance, the main topic is economic growth and an inclusive economic growth. They had a target for economic growth, which is 7% per year until 2015, and they plan, it's said by the Prime Minister, by the President of the Central Bank, and by the Finance Minister, that they plan to be, in 2050, the largest world economy. So, although they have a liberal speech, a liberal narrative, what they are doing, in fact, is developmentalism. So, I think that we Brazilians, we Latin Americans have seriously back to consider developmentalism as a national growth strategy. If we do not do that, Latin America will be condemned to irrelevance in the global economy. That's it.
Robert, words.
Well, let me just say I'm very pleased to be here, and in particular to meet again my friend Luis Carlos Bressa Pereira, whom I simply know of as Bressa. And I'm delighted to see this kind of this beginning. It's a small beginning, but it is a beginning in new developmentalism thinking. And I would very much agree with the last speaker that it is critical that Latin America, also other parts of the global South, reconsider their commitment to the Washington Consensus. The point being that if I was the emperor of the world and I was a Westerner and I was very anxious to maintain my position in the West at the top of the global hierarchy and benefit my supporters in the West, I would be very keen to have the rest of the world following the Washington Consensus, because that would be a way of ensuring that I remain on top and they remain underneath, supplying me and my population with lots and lots of resources. So this is a very good thing from the point of view of the West, and my concern is to what extent are challenges coming from the South to this very dominant perspective, and that's one theme of my talk late this afternoon.
Thank you. Well, it's open. Now I'm going to make my first question.
Yes.
Before speaking about the theme of this class, the determination of the exchange rate, I would like to say a few words about one thing that has been calling my attention more strongly recently. And this, I began to look, to think which were the five or the key models of classical developmentalism. And well, I think the one is the big push that of Rosenstein-Rodin, three of Prebisch, the deterioration of the terms of change, the foreign constraint, and these two, the two. A fourth was Arthur Liu's classical paper on the transference of labor. And finally, one paper, one contribution on structural inflation by Noyola, a Mexican. These were things that happened in the 50s. Or the first paper of 1943. Well, and what do they have in common? They have in common, they are the solution for them, for the problems that they show, is industrialization. That was the. Among these five, I would like only to say a few words about the foreign constraint, because the foreign constraint that I remember very well when I began to learn about economics in the 50s and about the ideas of Cepal, Prebisch. I learned about the foreign constraint first, about the two perverse income elasticities that exist in that the developing countries face. Well, and I asked myself, well, when I began to approximate in the late 80s from the post-Keynesians, and I began to go to the conferences in Tennessee. I remember very well, I think that was a meeting 89, I'm not sure, about that, in which Paul Davidson, who was the leader of post-Keynesian economics at that time, he said, finally we have a theory of economic growth. And this theory is based on the foreign constraint, and specifically on the formalization of the foreign constraint made by Anthony Trewell. And I was interested. Years passed. Enormous literature was developed about the foreign constraint. Actually, before that, Chenery and Chenery.
Deixa eu arrumar o seu microfone.
They developed a model in 62 about the two-gap model, but with the post-Keynesian, the thing became really a very important thing. And I want to suggest you that is, I don't say that is shit, but not very far from shit. sorry to say that. Why I say that? Because previous foreign constraint is not a model of economic development at all. Not also the formalization of it by Tier Wall. Why we need, we have models when they have some utility. Which is the utility of the foreign constraint model? I see two possible utilities. Maybe there are a third that I don't know. But one is to legitimize industrialization. The solution for the foreign constraint is to industrialize. There's no other. Actually, in my view, is the only. But then came this idea that is a model of economic development. But why? Well, because it is also, it legitimates imports of capital. Growth with foreign savings, growth with foreign indebtedness, which is exactly, new developmentalism was born in 2001, 2002, criticizing this. So, in my view, the foreign constraint model is a very important model, but exclusively to justify industrialization. It's the same thing that happens with the big push. The big push, not because you can have planning out of big push, but of deterioration of terms of exchange also. The solution is industrialization. The solution of the structural inflation, again, the problems of the strangulamentos. Yes. Inside of supply, they disappear as the country develops and the markets become more well organized. And so I think that we need a more critical analysis of this because this is about the problem of the foreign constraint. What is the consequence of the foreign constraint? What is the bad consequence of the foreign constraint? It's not necessarily current account deficit. No. The consequence is that countries that have this foreign constraint, they have to have an exchange rate that the market is supposed to balance, but an exchange rate that is more depreciated than it would be if the foreign constraint didn't exist, if the country was already industrialized. That's it. Well, this was a note that I want to make, because I think this is important. There is no paper about this critique of the foreign constraint, and you should have. Well, now about the determination of the exchange rate. Well, this is a central problem in new developmentalism. When we wrote, Nelson, Zé Luis, and I, we wrote the book, Developmental Macroeconomics. We already discussed this. Actually, the best discussion is not in the English edition, that is a 2014 edition, but in the Portuguese edition, because it was 2 years later and we developed a little better the ideas, especially in relation to the determination of the exchange rate. But anyway, the thing, it was not satisfying to myself, in my view. And then we began to work on this. I and Nelson, we have been involved in research on that matter. We have a recent research involving several economies of Latin America and involving Argentina, Mexico, Chile, and Colombia to discuss the determination of the exchange rate and the importance of the exchange rate in economic development. Well, while I finally was able to write a paper together with Eliane Araújo and Carmen Feijó, a paper whose title is The Determination of the Exchange Rate, period. It's not only the determination on developing countries, it's in general. It is this, and there is also in the paper is being submitted to a journal. It was finished very recently, and it contains 2 econometric tests about which I will not speak, that reasonably confirmed our ideas, our model. Well, we know that the exchange rate is absolutely central in new developmentalism. It is the price of the foreign money. It is one of the 5 macroeconomic prices. It is the more strategic of the 5 macroeconomic prices, not the more important, the more strategic. The more important, you are in capitalism, the more important is the profit rate, the expected profit rate, if you want. And it is central to new developmentalism together with the current account. Current account also is absolutely central to new developmentalism. You see this. Well, one basic idea in new developmentalism that Nelson make his class about this is that the policies must make right the 5 macroeconomic prices. My friend Tom Paley recently published absurd, ridiculous paper on investigação econômica, in English, but investigação econômica, criticizing new developmentalism. One of the critics is that in defending the 5 macroeconomic prices to be right, I normally use the right with Cotton Marx. That I was a neoclassical economist. that new developmentalism was neoclassical economics. Ridiculous. I explained very clearly it's not. It's a policy determined. The interest rate must be similar to the rich countries, interest rate plus the country risk. The wage rate must grow with productivity if the technical progress is neutral. Inflation must be low. The profit rate must motivate companies to invest. And the exchange rate must be competitive. Nelson discussed this. Well, and this is central. When that 3 books were published, the first was including Chalmers Jones was not an economist; he was a political scientist. But in the book of Robert, there was already a macroeconomic analysis. But this was not very. People didn't pay attention to this, and they were concerned with industrial policy. I am in favor of industrial policy for sure, always have been. But you have to have also the 5 macroeconomic prices right, and to have the 5 macroeconomic prices right, you have to have policies, because the market is fully enabled to keep these five macroeconomic prices right. Even orthodox economics recognized this when they created the central banks. Why? We don't need central banks if Marx are so wonderful as neoclassicals say. Marx are a wonderful institution, but this, you cannot ask for them from the market more than it can give. Well, in relation to the exchange rate, the fundamental idea in new developmentalism is that the exchange rate must be competitive. Instead of saying must be in equilibrium. We can say this also, but and this was first developed in my 208 book, a paper on the Ricardian, on the Dutch disease, Ricardian approach. But where we have a current equilibrium, that is the real equilibrium, the equilibrium that the exchange rate is supposed to guarantee if the market worked perfectly well, and the industrial equilibrium, that is the competitive exchange rate when there is Dutch disease. And if there is no Dutch disease, in principle, the current equilibrium is also the competitive equilibrium. Well, why the exchange rate is the more strategic price? Because besides determining imports, exports, and inflation, it determines the acquisitive power of wages, the acquisitive power of rents and rentier wealth. This is interesting because the first thing I realized, I knew, but the second thing was not so clear. And around 2012 to 13, there was a debate because some developmental economists proposed the social developmentalism, and they rejected. And the main problem, this was a problem, is that they didn't like the depreciation that new development required once and for all to put the exchange rate in the competitive net level and maintain it there. And I tried to argue to my friends that they were wrong because they were thinking in short term, and you should think in the long term. And in long term, I used to say, well, salaries and wages will lose acquisitive power, no doubt. Who will win with the depreciation are the tradable, non-commodity goods and service goods. Not the agricultural goods, if they are the source, which are the source of one of the sources, together with the mining of the Dutch disease. And they didn't accept this. Finally, after the debate had practically ended, came to me a second argument. It's not only the wages and the salaries that go down in the acquisitive power. It's also the rents of the rentiers. It's the dividends, the interest received, and the real estate rents. Actually, I ask myself, strange that the neoclassical economists they never speak about the exchange rate. They don't like this thing at all. No? Why? No? They are the representatives of the rentiers and financiers. Why? Then I said, what happens with a depreciation to the rentiers? And then came this idea that I just said. The rents fall, the acquisitive power of the rents fall in the same way that falls for wages and salaries. But besides that, the wealth of rentiers, when it's in the local money, also falls. And this is not a problem for the workers because they don't have wealth to lose. And third, to depreciate, you have to lower the interest rate. This is fundamental. No? It's one of it's not the only policy, but it is a policy that you have to have an interest rate that is in equilibrium. No? It's right. When you, and this is, and low interest rates for rentiers and financiers is no good. They don't like this at all. The basic revenues finally came from them, from the interest. So, and the others are tied to the interest. So, I realized that when you defended the workers, you were defending the rentiers and financiers, and not really only the workers, or especially the workers. Well, então, the exchange rate determines the acquisitive power of wages, the acquisitive power of rentiers and financiers, the expected profit rate. This is fundamental. The investment rate, because expected profit rate increases when you have the competitive exchange rate, and so the growth rate. Well, this is what determines the exchange rate. Do you have some new ideas about this? Yes, we have. I think we have, at least. We propose that there are 4 basic determinants of the exchange rate, two of which are well known. That is the interest rate differential and the terms of trade. And we have 2 additional determinants. This is what's new, if you want. One is the value of the foreign money and the current account balance. And I put in this slide that these 4 determinants, 2 of them are endogenous, the terms of trade and the value of the foreign money are not policy determined, while 2 of them are exogenous, are policy determined. The interest rate differential, you don't determine the interest rate of the United States, but the interest rate of central bank, of the Brazilian, of the national central banks, you do. And the current account balance. And this is new also. Let us discuss a little these 4 determinants. Well, about the interest rate differential, there is not much to discuss because this is very well known. The rich countries' average interest rates, the interest rate differential depends on the rich countries' average interest rates, the country risk, and the central bank's monetary policy, the local central bank's monetary policy. The country risk, what's interesting to say about this is that new developmentalism began with two papers that I wrote with Nakano in 2001. They were published in 2002 and 2003. And one of them was about the interest rate. This paper made a big fuss, a large debate, because my friends, my colleagues on the theory of inertial inflation from PUC became mad about the paper, and it began then our breakup, breakdown. Because the basic idea in the paper is that the interest rates in Brazil were too high. It was at that time was 10% real terms, too high, and why I said too high, because they were higher than the interest rate, the international interest rate plus the country risk. So this was out there at that time. About the terms of trade. No, these are the interest rate of the central bank is exogenous. The terms of trade depend fundamentally of the price of commodities, because the price of the manufactured goods are much more stable. This is fully endogenous. Very important, but endogenous, you cannot do anything about this. Nobody discovered how to control the price of commodities. Okay. One thing that's new, now the two new variables. One is the value of the exchange rate. This is one idea that's appeared for the first time in 2013 in a paper. I used the Dutch disease to discuss really the value of the foreign exchange, the value of the exchange rate, or the value of the foreign money. Something. How value? Yes, value. I learned in my classical economics, not classical development, but classical economics, I learned with Ricardo, with Marx, that prices, that the goods have a value and a price. And then came that ridiculous subjective theory of value that inaugurated neoclassical economics. But ignoring this, that is really makes no sense. When I make you say that, we stick to the labor theory of value. Well, but if this theory is basically right, and I believe it is, I said to myself, well, why the foreign money, that's not a good, but it is representative of the goods that a country produces and trades internationally. Why couldn't also the exchange rate have a value besides a price? That's a price, obviously. Have you a value that would be an alternative to the purchasing power parity thing, not really a theory. Well, and I conclude that yes, it has a value. Which value is this? How to define this this value. The value of the exchange rate is the value that covers the costs plus reasonable profit of the goods mostly traded by the country. This is what I propose to be the definition of this value. On what depends this value? Depends basically on the variations on the costs and the variations in the productivity of the country. In the exported goods. Well, the variations, and this variation depend on what? Well, I'm sorry. They depend on the variation of the costs and the productivity of the exported goods and the variations of the same goods abroad in the other countries. This is what determines. Well, there is a variable that measures this. We didn't invent. It's a well-known variable. Is the comparative unit labor cost. The unit labor cost is wages divided by productivity, and the comparative is when you compare the unit labor cost between countries. Okay, and there is, but you don't have you have to have you have an index, and the variations, specifically the variations of this are determined by the, again, an index well known called the comparative unit labor cost index, the Cauchy. Well, so the value depends on the Cauchy. Period. And this is a theoretical justification for the determination of the exchange rate, for the value and the price. That's, I mean, replaces with much better the PPP. Look, one interesting thing is that this purchasing power parity, this unit labor cost thing, the relation with the exchange rate, the economists knew. They didn't have a theory to relate clearly one from the other. I am presenting the theory here with this concept of value. But they use this pragmatically often. For instance, when there was the euro crisis between 2010 and 2015-14, finally a few economists were able to define more clearly it. We did that immediately here in Brazil because you have this theory. But I was developing this theory at that time, but of the value. But a few European economists realized that the problem was that the exchange rate of the German euro was devaluated in relation to the other euro monies, the French, the Portuguese, the Spanish, the Greek, And was this that allowed, that was the cause of the crisis, because of this made, since Germany, not only Germany, also North European countries, had a relatively depreciated currency, they realized large spot surpluses and so large deficits in the south countries of Europe, of the euro area, and the crisis. I remember Martin Wolf speaking about that, indignant about the surpluses of Germany. Really, the surpluses are, we'll discuss this again in a few minutes. These surplus are not a cooperative way of working. So, you see, this theory is not just theory. It's a theory with a practical application. I wrote a paper about this at that time with Pedro Rossi. I think it's a good paper. Well, this about the value of the exchange rate or the value of the foreign money is a determinant. This variation determining the exchange rate are also a determinant, one of the four main determinants. Finally, we have the current account balance. This is interesting, because curiously nobody says this. I remember a friend of mine saying, when he saw I saying or write, and I think saying, that the exchange rate depended on the current account balance. And I said, well, since when? How? Why? And at that, when he made this question, I had already a fast answer. Because first, they took the time for me to come to this idea. And the first thing I realized that there was no, I didn't put the graphic. I should have put. There is a figure. I realized that there is a question of proportion. When you have a relatively depreciated exchange rate, you have a surplus. When you have a relatively overvalued exchange rate, you have a deficit in the current account. When the exchange rate is in equilibrium, you have zero current account. This in a country that does not have the Dutch disease. I had this proportion in my head. Then I came to a figure that I forget to. I failed to put here in the presentation. I should have done. It is a figure where you have in the abscess the current account balance, surplus, deficit, in the center a line, 0, and then you draw a line like this. And this line like this is the exchange rate, which is the lower you go down, the more appreciated is the exchange rate. If you go makes this way, it would be an inversement and the same thing. Well, this is what I knew. No? This graphic or this figure was the second thing, but the third thing was also a more, let's say, economic reasoning. And which is the economic reasoning? Well, if you have a current account surplus, this means that the capital flows for this country will be negative. It will have a surplus in capital flows. Here's a country that is investing in other countries. And the inverse is true. So there is an additional capital flow, positive or negative, which increase when they are positive. They are increasing the supply of foreign money in the country, and the exchange rate is appreciating. If it is negative, the money is going out, and the supply is negative, and the country and the exchange rate depreciates. So this is also a very important determination of the exchange rate. Now, I put here that the current account balance is exogenous. And this is again very surprising. Several people look how? The current account balance depends on the exchange rate. When you have a shock in the exchange rate, for some reason, the exchange rate changes, and then appears a deficit or a surplus, depending on what's positive or negative shock. Yes, for sure. This is right, and this is what normally happens. Usually happens. But actually, you have to think in a different way. We have to divide the countries into types of countries. The countries that have a current account policy, and the countries that don't have. The countries that have a current account policy, they have a policy of surpluses, or they may have a policy of deficits, but it's a policy. The policy of not having deficit or surplus is not really a policy. This is what the market is supposed to do. Well, what observe practically in modern capitalism is that there are some countries that always have permanently current account deficits. This is the case of the Latin American countries. I believe that's also the case. No, African is different. This is the probably also of the Latin American, African, but I don't know. I didn't check this. And this is the case of the United States. They have always permanently, the United States since the 60s, deficit, current account deficit. And there are other countries, like Germany and the East Asian countries, that have permanently surpluses. In the case of China, for instance, in these 42 years of an incredible growth, the Chinese had a current account deficit only in 3 years, and small current account deficit. The other years were surplus. Well, if you have this relatively permanent surplus or deficits, you have to conclude that this is this deficit or policy, this deficits or surpluses are policy determined, and so they are exogenous, because demarked with determined equilibrium. Okay, a stable equilibrium, the exchange rate would be floating, would be volatile, or misalignments would happen all the time. But just misalignments around the equilibrium. No, that's not what happened in the United States, for instance, or in Brazil. We have always that. So, if you want, the deficit varies around a deficit. The deficit around one basic deficit. Brazil, let's say, around 3% of GDP, more or less. We have to measure, never was meant to measure, which is the average current account deficit in Brazil. And same applies for the surplus countries. Why? Why they have policies? Well, for the surplus countries, they have to have, this is a logical deduction, and why they have surplus because they want to be more competitive internationally, and because their government, so their people are ready to accept, in the short term, a certain reduction in their wages and rents, the acquisitive power of wages and rents. If they have this, okay. In the case of the opposite case, of the deficits and deficits and deficits, the basic reason in Latin America is because they are growing with foreign savings. This was the beginning of, as I told you, this critique was because I began this in 2001, and I remembered very well, I had this idea when I was in the National Forum of Veloso. Complete name of Veloso.
His brother.
It's Reis Veloso. And there was someone speaking about the exchange rate, and then I remember the administration of Fernando Henrique Cardoso, and when the administration began, he said immediately to us, I was one of the ministers, not in the economic area. I was excluded happily from the economic area, happily at posteriori, because the results were very bad of the policies. And he said, well, our strategy to grow is to grow with foreign savings. We are going, now you have credit, and you grow. When the current account deficit appeared, because the current account in the times of high inflation was practically zero, nobody wanted to make loans to a country with that incredible inflation. The deficit appeared, and the economic team, when appeared the first deficit, the economic team commemorated. That commemorated the current account deficit. Look at that. That was a policy, a wonderful policy. In the case of the United States, no, it's not a policy in this sense. I think that in the case of the United States is a populist policy. Populist, yes, populist. Populist for Reagan, for Clinton, for Nixon, for Obama, for these wonderful presidents, for these wonderful governments of a wonderful country. No, policy, yes, populism. because they, when they had when they led the Bretton Woods agreements in 1944, they had enormous current account surplus, and they including guaranteed the convertibility to dollar, to gold of the dollar, because they were certain that this would happen, would continue to happen forever. But in the 60s, they began to incur in current account deficits, and they realized that these current account deficits were no problem, or were apparently no problem. Why no problem? Because they could have, these deficits would be in dollars, they print dollars, so no problem. Giscard d'Estaing, that at that time, 60s, was the finance minister of de Gaulle. Giscard d'Estaing would be later the prime minister of France, but still as finance minister, referring to these current account deficits of the United States, he said that this was privilege. Well, that's the adjective.
Exorbitant.
Privilege.
Huh?
Exorbitant.
Exorbitant. It was an exorbitant privilege. And the Americans continue to believe that this is a privilege. They are wrong. They are being populists. Because they don't, the possibility of they falling in a financial crisis, in a currency crisis, zero. Won't. Yeah. The argument works. But it is also zero for Japan, because Japan is indebted, as I know, in years, period. But United States. But since they have current account deficits, their exchange rate is appreciated. And since their exchange rate is appreciated, consumption is higher. Workers, employees, rentiers are all happy with this. But manufacturing becomes less competitive. Sure, necessarily. Well, so you see, this idea that the current account is exogenous, I think is very important, and has very well. And there is John Williamson's famous fundamental equilibrium, wonderful equilibrium. Actually, I came to this equilibrium before reading John Williamson, because I said that besides the current equilibrium and the industrial equilibrium, there was also foreign debt equilibrium. The foreign debt equilibrium that I put. And the foreign debt equilibrium was the exchange rate that kept the foreign debt GDP of the country stable. And this is what the fundamental exchange rate says, basically. There are other variables, makes a little more of mathematical confusion, but essentially the idea is that. Well, what is the, I think I'm finishing. What is the outcome of this? The outcome is is an overvalued currency. Now, I was saying. The fundamental. Actually, this is a way, this fundamental equilibrium exchange rate is a way of legitimizing sporting capitals. And when you go to study what is imperialism, what's modern imperialism, what's industrial imperialism, the form that of this imperialism is basically, besides the non-economic, administrative, violent, in some way or other means that they may use, but in the case of Latin America, for countries already democratic, etc., the two instruments fundamentally is the unequal exchange and foreign and capital exports. Please, China copied. You know that new development is highly critical of this kind of growth with foreign savings policy. That's all. Countries only can grow in this having current account deficits in very special cases, situations, when the country is already growing very fast, and in this situation, the marginal propensity to consume falls, the marginal propensity to invest increases, and then the substitution of a foreign, of domestic or foreign savings falls. And so the foreign money, positive capital flows are help instead of stopping economic growth. Well, I think that this is, here I put this graphic to you see the three curves. The industrial equilibrium is in the top, in the middle the current equilibrium, and in the below the fundamental equilibrium, or the current or the foreign debt equilibrium. You see that the third is much more overvalued. This is good for the north, not for the south. Well, this class was based on a paper, The Determination of the Exchange Rate, that I wrote with Eliane Araújo and Carmen Feijó. It counts with two econometric tests that are reasonably confirm the theory. It's now being submitted to a journal. And I am going to put also in my site, I think I didn't put. Thank you. The idea is to have questions also.
Questions, do coffee break first, or we can make questions first? Or do you prefer?
No, let's have the questions now. Then if there is all
Okay.
Okay,
we have time for a few questions, so please.
No. Also say for the people in the YouTube that they can.
Yes, people that are watching us in YouTube can also send questions by the link in the YouTube. Okay, that you can say that you see the questions here. Professor Wade, please, and then Professor Oreiro. Anybody else? Okay, please.
Bressa, thank you very much. That was a fascinating talk. You remember that in the original Bretton Woods proposals of Keynes and some others, this question of the exchange rate was very, very central. And the architecture proposed, the international architecture proposed by Keynes, contained two features, two mechanisms. And one mechanism was that countries in exceptional circumstances could devalue, number one, and number two, countries running persistent surpluses, or countries running surpluses, should be penalized in one way or another. And there were several ways to penalize, such as imposing progressive interest rates on their surpluses. So the bigger the surpluses, the more they would pay. So those were the two basic mechanisms, as I understand it, that Keynes came out with in Bretton Woods. And of course, the Americans completely vetoed that. But do you think that it is possible to devise an international system which contains these two mechanisms for international management of exchange rates? Do you think that this is the way forward, given the fundamental point that at the moment we have an exchange rate non-system, an international non-system for managing exchange rates? It's a total disaster, and so the question is, is it worth pushing forward with these two mechanisms that Keynes proposed?
I think it is. In relation to the deficits, what Keynes was also defending was a fixed exchange rate. And to go back to a fixed exchange rate, I think it will be very difficult. But a managed exchange rate with rules, this is perfectly possible. And I think that these rules should exist. And rules for deficits and rules for surpluses. And for surplus, also a penalization would be wonderful and possible, because and now the United States has no objection to this, I suppose. What I did many years ago was to make a more simple thing. I proposed that instead of having, that you should have 3% of GDP maximum current account surplus, and that the international system should acknowledge that, 3 or 4. And I remember that in one of the first meetings of the G20, the Americans supported that. But the others no, and this thing didn't progress. So we can go in this direction also.
Well, Bresser, I will make a question relating the theory that you presented with the Brazilian case. The overvaluation of exchange rate can be decomposed in two parts. The first part is due to Dutch disease, which the difference between the industrial equilibrium exchange rate and the current account equilibrium exchange rate. The second part is due to the model of growth with foreign savings, which create effective level of exchange rate that is lower than the current account equilibrium exchange rate. Okay, that is the theory. Well, Brazil since 2007 had systematically current account deficits. Even after the Great Recession of 2014 to 2016, we still had current account deficit. In 2019, the current account deficit rose at 3% of GDP. Then we had the COVID-19 pandemics, which had a huge shock on the economic activity. But it devaluated the nominal exchange rate from 4 reais and 10 cents to more than 5 reais and 50 cents. This for a period of 2 years. But even after this huge devaluation of exchange rate, we still have a current account deficit that now is more or less 1.1%. Well, I saw that many times when you give interviews to the press, you say that an exchange rate below 5 will be appropriate for the Brazilian economy. But what the Brazilian data is showing is that the equilibrium exchange rate, the industrial equilibrium exchange rate, that is what matters for economic development and reindustrialization, should be much higher than 5 reais. Maybe 6, maybe 7, I do not have the number, but I think that we still have a huge overvaluation of our currency. I would hear your comments.
Well, I am not persuaded that you have a huge overvaluation of the real. I believe that 5 reais, maybe a little more, but not much, is a good rate. And why are you having this depreciated currency? Because also according to the theory, 5 or 5, something more than 5, but not much, would be the industrial equilibrium. The current equilibrium, I don't know which number would be exactly, but I believe around 450 today, more or less, 430. Yeah. They also made some research on that, and we have 520, 25 today. Why? I find only one explanation for this. Is trust, is confidence. We have a government that does not creates confidence anywhere. Absolutely. It's an absolute. And so, but this is, I know, is very difficult to prove, to demonstrate. So it's difficult. There is this equilibrium exchange rates are always difficult to check, to verify. But what I can respond to you now is this. Well, I think that we should stop here and have a break. Yes, somewhat late. 15 minutes. começando a aula. Quem for brasileiro, siga-me. E venha assistir a aula. Muito bom. Então, essa segunda aula é sobre a quasi-stagnation do Brasil and the second argument for import tariffs. The second argument in economics for import tariffs. This will be a shorter class because at this time I am, for good reasons, including because I am beginning to become tired. In my age, this is a problem. Let's go. Well, which is the problem? The problem at Brazil was growing almost at the same rate of East Asia up to 1980. Latin America was a little below. Since then, both Brazil and Latin America are quasi-stagnated, while East Asia continued to grow. Why? What to do? Before trying to respond to this question and discussing the second argument, just a few numbers and some numbers and a figure. The numbers. Since between 1961 and 1980, Latin America grew at 3.2%. Has been since 1991, 1.5. Brazil, worse, from 4.6 was a normal success at that time to 1.2. If you take in consideration also the 80s, is minus 0.7, but 1.2 here. East Asia, from 5.52 to 5. And East Asia, except China, 5.7 to 7.37. So Brazil is falling behind and behind and behind. This is quasi-stagnation. This is a disaster. You see the same thing in relation to Latin America in this figure. You see the growth being very similar until 1980. In case, if you make this figure for Brazil, this is the same. The two lines coincide. But after 1980, East Asia continues and Brazil stops. Why? Why are quasi-stagnant? I have been saying for some time already, for sure, the direct cause is the industrialization. Brazil suffered an enormous deindustrialization. Here I have a good figure of this deindustrialization. In the 80s, we had already in the 70s, end of 70s, we had 27%, and this went up to late 80s, and then began to fall. And this enormous fall, then a certain recuperation, but and then a new wave of deindustrialization. And today, 11%. They know, to 18, but so the industrialization was enormous. This was a cause. Which are the two basic causes for this deindustrialization? In my view, there are two. Brazil fell in the liberalization trap, and public investment has fallen. In this lecture, I will speak only about the first problem, although the second is absolutely important also, but since what I am interested in this class is in the problem of the second argument. The liberalization trap. I began to discuss this in a conference, keynote speech in Shanghai. And but then we really made a very beautiful paper. Eliane Araújo, it's there, a young economist from Rio Grande do Sul, Samuel Pérez, and myself. And the paper is called An Alternative to the Middle Income Trap. And the alternative to the middle income trap is the liberalization trap. And this liberalization trap, which is associated to the second argument in economics for import tariffs on manufactured goods. Well, first question is, how did Brazil industrialize despite the Dutch disease? Why Brazil, between 1930 until 1980, experienced a very fast growth, especially since 1950, but before already to us. This enormous industrialization. Brazil was the country that the growth rate of Brazil was, in brute terms, in gross terms, was the higher of all countries. In net terms, in per capita terms, only Japan was had a better performance. And since 1980, quasi-stagnation. The question that I'm asking now is why Brazil was able to develop so fast, industrialize so extraordinarily until 1980. Having the Dutch disease, and not knowing what was the Dutch disease. What the policymakers, the Brazilian policymakers, as the Latin American policymakers in general, knew is that economic development is industrialization, is a structural change, as you said at that time. And also we knew, or policymakers knew, not absolutely, but they knew that if they stopped the import tariffs, the industrialization would stop. Well, I say that they didn't know the Dutch disease. Yes, they didn't. The first paper on the Dutch disease is the Neri and Corden paper of 1982, when this growth had already finished. The first paper to discuss the neutralization of the Dutch disease, and is really a very different model also of Dutch disease, is my paper of 2008. And the first paper to discuss fully the use of import tariffs to neutralize the Dutch disease is my paper of only of 2020, the post-Keynesian economics, neutralizing the Dutch disease. This third paper. So the economists didn't know the Dutch disease, and nevertheless, Brazil industrialized. Economists and economics have one argument, and this argument is the famous, well-known argument of the infant industry. is the argument of Alexander Hamilton. Opa. I used to say that Alexander Hamilton is a patron of developmentalism, because he was a developmentalist, and as a Secretary of the Treasury of George Washington, in his report to manufacturers, he defended strongly tariffs with the argument of the infant industry argument. Later on, Friedrich List, a German, but he was for a long time in the United States and learned with the Hamiltonians. And List also became a famous defensor of the industrialization and of the infant industry argument. And his book was influential in Brazil, for instance. But not only in Brazil, but in Brazil it was indeed already in the 30s, 40s, this book was read and discussed. It was translated to Portuguese and discussed. The problem with this argument is that this argument is an argument by definition provisory. It is valid for some time until the industry, the industrial sector, industry in the American, in the English sense, the industrial sector becomes also mature, and then the tariffs are not more reasonable. They make no sense. They are just bad protectionism. I know that very well, no? And I have an interesting experience that I tell you very shortly. In 1987, I was finance minister of Brazil, and when I made my speech of acceptance speech, and my friends came, some of São Paulo, my family, to assist, went up to my office in the building of the ministry, and we were some way commemorating. Enters the room José Tavares, was an economist from Rio de Janeiro that I knew very well, a very good economist, who was the president of the a Comissão Aduaneira, the Commission on Tariffs of the Finance Ministry. And José Tavares told me that he had made the calculations and that the import tariff of Brazil was 45% average, and that the export subsidy of Brazil was 45% again. I didn't pay much attention to this subsidy, only to the import tariff. I said, this is unacceptable. This is pure protectionism. I am going to begin the trade liberalization. And I began. It was necessary first to transform all the administrative controls into tariffs, high tariffs. And after that, when everything was transformed in tariffs, we could lower the tariffs. I began. I remembered the World Bank becoming very surprising when they realized that the finance minister of Brazil was in favor of trade liberalization. And 3 years later, in 2 years later, 2 years and a little, Fernando Collor, the President Fernando Collor, opened the economy, lowering drastically these tariffs from 45% to 12%. today, I know that I was wrong. That I should not have begun. If I didn't, the other would soon know. But anyway, that I was wrong. Why I was wrong? Because that tariffs, they neutralize the Dutch disease. And that disease in Brazil is a very important thing. In the first lecture, I didn't spoke about the Dutch disease because I was discussing a developed country and the general case. But when you discuss countries with Dutch disease, you have to have it also into consideration. Observe that the argument. So the name that I propose to this argument in favor of the high tariffs is the Dutch disease argument. In my first paper of 2008 about Dutch disease, I already spoke about it, but as a second best. And the first best was a variable tax on the sports of commodities. And I discussed a lot this. And nobody or some in the agricultural sector were indignant, or I was just ignored. And I had a great friend who was also a banker, Fernão Bracher, and he used to said to me more than once, several times, look, Luis Carlos, I agree with you, but this sport tax on commodities, this never will be approved in Brazil. Because the agricultural sector, there are lots of producers, and they have political power. You say that they are not being damaged, but because the exchange rate will continue and it will be more stable, including if the government adopts a current exchange rate policy, but this never will happen. And finally, I decided that the second best was best, at least for countries in Latin America that are not especially or mostly sports of oil or iron. But what I realized also, and I gave more importance that I used to give, was to the fact that this strategy had been used before. That Brazil had used this strategy to neutralize the Dutch disease, that all Latin Americans did that. That import tariffs, the policymakers didn't know the Dutch disease, but knowing that industrialization was necessary, realizing that industrialization would stop if the tariffs were eliminated, they conserved the tariffs. The argument was only the argument of the infant industry. That was an argument that was not valid in most cases anymore. But in the lack of other arguments, you are pragmatic and go ahead. This ended when finally the liberals that were very critical of this became dominant in the world in 1980, in Brazil, in Latin America, in the end of the 80s, and then the neoliberal ideas became dominant, and the trade opening happened together with financial liberalization. Look about this. One thing, this form of neutralizing the Dutch disease was not used only in Brazil or only in Latin America. Another country that used this, in my view, I'm looking for someone who decides to write a paper about that, make a research and write a paper about that, is the United States. Why you say that? Well, first, because the United States was always a great exporter of agricultural goods, and in around 1900, it became a great exporter of oil, and oil that were exported, whose cost of production was very low. So this was a source of Dutch disease, obviously. And nevertheless, they also had that enormous growth. How? Well, separately, I have known this in these years that the United States that have maintained very high import tariffs until 1939. How can be this? When I first saw this, I said, well, this guy is wrong. It's impossible to be true this. The French opened in the 1830s. The English that were very late in opened their economy in the 840s. Now, United States, 100 years later, why? Well, if I had made this question seriously when I realized this, I would not have tried to check it. I checked, it was right, the number, and then I realized that what the Americans were doing were neutralizing the Dutch disease, simply. Not knowing, pragmatically, intuitively, as others. So this is a very important way of neutralizing the Dutch disease. In the book, in the last paper, in the 2010 paper, I made a proposal. Besides for making this analysis, I made a proposal. I proposed a reform on the tariff system of the countries. And which reform would be this? The reform would be that the country would establish in the law 2 tariffs. One tariff would be the usual tariff, the industrial policy tariff, if you want. This, which varies from good to good, or from industry to industry. And in my view, it should be low. Protection is not, in principle, is not a good thing. And companies are supposed to compete. Now, this would be one tariff, no change in relation to what exists. The other would be, the other tariff would be a single tariff for all manufactured goods, or more precisely, for all non-commodity traded goods, because services also includes. And this second tariff would be single, one for all goods, and would be variable. Variable according, the same way was the sport tax. Variable according to the prices of the commodity exported. When the price of the commodities went down, it could go to zero, disappear the tariff. But when they increase very much, the tariff would increase. It's very simple, no? And very, very feasible. And there is no problem with OMC if the country stays limited to I forgot the name they give to the tariff, but the tariff that in Brazil is 35%. Constant. Consolidated. The same argument applies to the subsidies, because the sport subsidies on manufactured goods, because the tariffs, they only neutralize the Dutch disease in relation to the domestic market. They don't neutralize in relation to exports. To do that, what you have to do is to establish a subsidy to exports. The experience about this, I believe that certainly is much smaller than the tariffs. And I personally know only one case. That was the case of Brazil, exactly. The Brazil in 1967, Antonio Delfim Neto, who is a developmentalist, is a conservative developmentalist, was a developmentalist. He became finance minister and created o Crédito Prêmio de Exportações. This beautiful name was nothing other than a subsidy to exports of manufactured goods. This subsidy remained until 1990, when, with the trade opening, and not only tariffs were reduced to 12, but the subsidies became zero. And this export subsidy, in the case of Brazil, was incredibly successful. To have an idea, in 1965, the exports of manufactured goods in Brazil represented 6% of total exports of Brazil. I remember in the first edition of my book, Development Crisis in Brazil, I believe that I note that and said that's very small, must increase this. But I didn't have all the theories that I have today. And 25 years later, only 25 years later, in 1990, this figure had increased from 6 to 62%. Incredible. Brazil became an important exporter of manufactured goods. Brazil was competing internationally on the exports of manufactured goods. Well, maybe this subsidy, and maybe, for sure, not maybe, this subsidy and this import tariff that Brazil used, 45%, was too much. There was in this tariff not only the neutralization of the Dutch disease, but also there was protectionism. But at least half of this would be perfectly legitimate. I conclude with one comment on Brazilian economists and Brazilian developmental economists, social, new, doesn't matter. Developmentalist economists. Well, also we already saw that For them, industrial policy is very important. Okay, I agree. Industrial policy is very important. Not only industrial policy, plus the 5 macroeconomic crises. But which is the more important industrial policy in history? I have no doubt about this question, the response of this, the answer to this question. Are tariffs. Import tariffs are by far the more important tool that countries adopted to industrialize, for sure. So, our economists, our developmental economists, should be discussing this. Should be discussing the problem of tariffs. No discussion. I don't know no paper about this. I don't know articles in the newspapers about this. Only a few mine, but it's appear in the, that's all. No paper. Why this? And the only thing that I can conclude is that the ideological hegemony of neoliberalism and neoclassical economics was so strong that they paralyzed our people. I see, for instance, the present government trying to reduce unilaterally tariffs. No word about this. I see the government, not only this, before or read, very much involved in making an agreement with the European Union. Wonderful. But in this agreement, there is dispositions about the tariffs. You know, what discuss this again. So, if Brazil wants to grow, it has to resolve this problem of the Dutch disease. More amply, it has to resolve the exchange rate problem, and it has to resolve the public investments problem, because they have fallen very, very strongly. If you don't do that, there are many other things. You need education, you need health care, you need good institutions, you good investments in infrastructure. All this, for sure, you need to. Everybody knows. If you don't do more, it's because of that or reason or other. But no, people don't know what they have to do in relation to the exchange rate. In relation to the public investments, many people know. One of the good things that happened while PT was in government was that they were able to increase the investment rate in public investments in a very reasonable way. Thank you. Questions?
Questions?
Professor, it's to me again. When I was at the conference in India, I have a long conversation with Martin Wolf, which is the chief economist of the Financial Times. And we talk about Brazil. Well, he expressed his worries about a state cup in Brazil, which I dismiss. But we also talk about exchange rate and the Brazilian development model. He is against, as a liberal economist, of this import substitution strategy, but he said to me that Brazil was committing a terrible mistake in not imposing an export tax over commodities. He favored export tax over commodities as a weapon to have as a weapon to devaluate exchange rate and make manufacturing industry competitive. It's the first thing. It's this conversation with Martin Wolf. But the second point is the following. According to the current rules of the World Trade Organization, Brazil cannot raise unilaterally its import tariffs because if Brazil did so, it will be retaliated by our main trade partners. It's in the agreement of World Trade Organization that Brazil makes part. The only possible way to increase import tariffs is to use the justification of environment protection. For instance, you can say that some imports from China do not obey the climate rules of Brazil, and then you can impose import taxes over the Chinese imports because of that. And I think that we will suffer in the next years from exactly this problem. The Europeans, mainly France and Germany, are about to impose an import tax over the Brazilian products based in ecological reasons, because they say that many of our soybeans, iron ore, or cattle that we export do not obey the European rules on climate conservation. So that's just food for thought for you. Thank you.
Look, Luis, I am not discussing WTO. WTO is an important thing, but WTO was essentially an instrument of the United States to open the economies. So we have a different argument that besides the argument of the environment, of the climate change. We have a different argument. And you have to use this argument and face and confront the people. Well, hope you do that.
Professor, I have a question which will fall into the same suggestion mentioned by Professor Orero, which is an export tariff on commodities, right?
This is a
The
very
one-
good thing.
The one you mentioned that it's politically difficult to be implemented, but makes sense. And the point is that, in a way, the diagnosis of Dutch diseases is the opposite diagnosis of CEPAL, right?
The opposite of what?
Of CEPAL, of ECLAD.
Not opposite.
Previous.
They don't know the Dutch disease.
No, allow me. What I mean is that Prebisch was saying that prices of agricultural commodities would go lower and lower when relative to industry prices.
Yes.
The Dutch disease, in a way, says the opposite. Says that the prices of commodities go high. In a way, the income of that exports, because it's a lot of revenues from that kind of export, would harm industry. So I'm just saying this not to make a great debate about this school of thought, moreover, because it's a different time in history, but to mention that a tariff on exports of commodities would be a good thing if it was temporary. Say a tariff that, for example, would be imposed only for times of very high prices, not a permanent tariff. And this is a way also of self-regulating our inflow of currency, of foreign currency, and also regulating making the treasury to take part of the proceeds of some extraordinary time in price. So that idea of tariffs on exports of commodities, but based maybe in only for times a threshold price or something like that, I still think that is an idea that makes a lot of sense. So I would like to hear your views on that. Thank you.
I forgot to answer this part of José Luis' question. For sure, export tax is a very good solution. And if you can use it, wonderful. The problem is that in Brazil this seems to be impossible. I was just being politically impossible. I was just being practical on this matter. Anyway, what I think also very important is that tariffs are also a very good instrument. All instruments have problems, but we have, I am very much interested in arguing about this, about the Dutch disease argument, neutralization of the Dutch disease argument, because it is the second and the only second argument in favor of tariffs. But it's a very important argument. Historically, it's a very important argument. So I am saying that this argument that's important historically makes sense. If I can use both, if I can mixtures of the two, there are several ways of dealing with this. The problem is that governments have to have, as a policy, to have an exchange rate policy, and the exchange rate policy, when the country has a Dutch disease, includes the neutralization of the Dutch disease in some way. Now, please.
I have one question. I want to address a little more the import tariff question, because as you, sir, have mentioned, we should confront some people, confront some ideas, and as you speak, it makes clear that we're talking about the World Trade Organization. And I think we have, when we talk about import tariffs, separated from what the products are, it's much more difficult than talking about what the products are in fact. So when we're talking about that in general, we might get retaliated by France, by Germany, and by other economies. But when we are talking about, for example, health products, pharmaceutical industry, we might have some progress in that area. So what I'm saying is Brazil developed a program, for example, Inovar Alto, which was a program for the vehicle industry, automobilistical industry, that was retaliated by World Trade Organization. But when we developed the Lei dos Genéricos, generical industry, pharmaceutical industry program, when we developed the Parceria do Desenvolvimento Produtivo, PDP, which was also a political industry program, we made success. So what I'm saying is, what do you think about this kind of approach to political, industry programs that are tied to social demands?
Well, for sure, programs related to social demands are important, but not tariffs. Tariffs on medicaments is not a very nice thing. But in my, in the general analysis, also medicaments, it's the opposite what we are saying. That is the opposite. What I insist, what I am just is to have, to distinguish two objectives in the tariffs. One objective is what I call the industrial policy objective. And the other objective is neutralization of the Dutch disease. Full neutralization, partial neutralization, because it puts smaller tariffs that are not sufficient to neutralize, but the fact is that if policymakers don't consider the problem, they continue to not know the problem. They continue to think that what they are doing is violating the logic of economics, the logic of the market. New developmentalism is a theory that respects fully the logic of market, but that believes that the market works in different ways and in different situations, and so you have to consider these different situations. This is in all problems. The problem, for instance, that we discuss of the current account policy. I'm not ignoring the market, but I am saying that the countries have a policy on that matter. Some not all. Some countries have a policy on surplus, and they have to put this in my theory. Again, I have to put in the theory. I have to put in policy the Dutch disease. If I have the Dutch disease, but it's just to waive. Another question is that I am against current account surpluses normally. I am against gross foreign indebtedness. I think that this does not help, but normally damages. It damages not only because it causes crisis. Before causing crisis, because this encourages industrialization, investment in manufacturing industry. So, these theories are beautiful theories, I hope, but are theories that have to have use, have to be practical also. Well, I think that I can. Let me only tell you one thing that maybe a few of you still don't know. I am writing a book, a kind of introductory book. I am writing a book, introductory book, that will be called New Developmentalism, only that. And this subtitle will be A New Economics. I am going to discuss with the publisher maybe a new economics and political economy. This book I am writing this book because I received an invitation. I was very happy about this invitation. That came from Edward Elgar, a great publisher of books. And suddenly, coming from the sky, came an email from a lady, the editor, that I don't know, invited me to write this book. I tell you this because the book is being written, and because this shows that the developmentalism is progressing, and people are becoming interested. This lady, she's an editor, she's interested in selling books, and he thought that this theme could be a good theme. Thank you.
So before starting Nelson's presentation, I just wanted to make a special thanks to Young Scholar Initiative of INET with whom Juliano here and Leonardo also are part of it. They were of great support for realizing this event. And so for those who doesn't know it, and also for those who are watching us, the Young Scholar Initiative is a organization, a network for stimulating pluralist thinking and new economic thinking, which is very important, especially in these times that economics are, mainstream economics are being very frustrating to deal with the economic and socioeconomic challenges. So there is different working groups for young scholars. We are from the Latin American working group, but also there's Keynesian working group, gender working group, and they provide us a lot of instruments for connecting people. They also are very important financing events of pluralist economics. So I wanted to thank Young Scholar Initiative very much. Also, FGV has a disclaimer that we have to say, so I'm going to read it here quickly. So the statements expressed by Fundação Getulio Vargas employees and guests who take part in the online event and broadcast exclusively represent their opinions and not necessarily FGV institutional position. We will also reiterate that everyone presented here spontaneously agreed to participate in this event and to authorize the use of their name, voice, and image besides assessing copyrights related to the exhibition of this broadcast, which will be available later on FGV official website. So thank you, Nelson, please.
Bom dia, good morning. And I will discuss with you this. Bresser told in his class that 5 macroeconomic prices is relevant for our theory. So, and then this is actually a research that we are developing nowadays in our center. So it's a work in progress. So comments and suggestions are welcome. And we are trying to define first theoretically which are these macroeconomic prices, not which are the macroeconomic price, but which is the level of macroeconomic prices, okay? Because we are saying always in our paper, so to keep the macroeconomic prices in the right level is relevant, but you never say, excepting for exchange rate, which is this level. So this right level for us, and then you speak about this in this presentation. Much more theoretically, I will bring some data about the exchange rate, but we want to discuss this formulation and these concepts that we will present it now for you. Okay. First, is relevant to make a distinction between these micro and macro prices. Okay, macro prices in general and defined by markets. Okay, markets are fundamental to the process of economic development. Everybody knows, and an excellent institution for coordination in competitive environments. Okay, but this is prices in general, okay? Mostly micro prices must be defined by the market, with the exception of some monopoly prices, okay? We are talking I'm talking here about the more competitive environments, as I said to you. Okay, but when you talk about macro prices, okay, we call this macro prices because they affect, without exception, all sectors and investment decisions in the economy. Okay, so it's not a specific price of a product or a service. Okay, so we call these prices macroeconomic price, and the predominance, if you talk about this price, the predominance of a value defined by market equilibrium will not necessarily imply greater economic growth with equality, or not for equity. Okay, equity, but more equity is equality, I want to say. Okay, why? Because I say that, but in general, the right price of the market wrong prices from the macroeconomic perspective, okay? And what we call by wrong prices, and the theory has to say, oh, this is a wrong price, and you need to adopt wrong prices to develop some sectors. That is, I mean by wrong price, or what do you mean by wrong prices? Is prices that are followed or sometimes managed by the government. Okay, are the right level for macroeconomic price. So what the literature in general says, wrong prices is what you call, in our theory, right prices. Okay, why the level of macroeconomic prices must be followed or managed by the government? Because when these prices are defined by the markets, they are not necessarily at the level that stimulate the sectors that are more sophisticated and more complex. Okay, in this statement, this definition is true, especially in developing countries where the profit margins is narrow in these sectors. Which sectors? The sectors that are more sophisticated and more complex. So if we just left to the market, okay, to define this five macroeconomic prices, what will happen is that possibly the sectors that will be more benefited by these prices will be the sectors that have a large profit margin, okay, and the other sectors that need more stimulus to grow and to develop will be less benefited by these prices, or even they could be harmful by this price, okay? Harmed by this price. So we will classify 5 prices in this category of macroeconomic prices: exchange rate, interest rate, wage rate, inflation rate, profit rate. And the later, the profit rate, is strongly influenced by the previous price. Yes? So let's talk about each one of them. Okay. The first price that we talk about is the exchange rate. Okay. As Bresser said to you, what do you call by this equilibrium? Okay. In terms of exchange rate, we understand the exchange rate. The equilibrium exchange rate must guarantee the current account balance. Okay. And we recently have estimated, we developed a model, Eliane, and Tiago and Rafael, we worked together in a model to try to define a model to estimate this exchange rate equilibrium, this equilibrium exchange rates. And then we first built a model of determinants of the exchange rate, including a proxy for current account balance, okay, which we use the trade balance of goods and services. Then we estimated the model, we calculated, based on this model, we calculated which would be the level of exchange rate that would be compatible with the equilibrium in the trade balance of goods and services. So then we find what will be the exchange rate that will generate this equilibrium. Okay, these results. The model is compatible with the explanations of Bresser about the equilibrium exchange rate that he made in his class, okay? And now I'm just showing for you some results of our tests, but the most relevant aspect that I want to show to you is that this is a vector error correction model. Okay, we made this model for Argentina, Brazil, Chile, Colombia. Mexico was not included because they adopt another methodology. Yes? Yeah. Yes. And this is the dependent variable is the exchange rates. Okay, these are the explanatory variables, and what I want to emphasize for you is that this variable, there is the trade of goods and services, okay, as percentual of GDP. The sign of this variable is positive. So we showed with this result that a high exchange rate is correlated with a positive result of the trade of goods and services. So positive results, this is I know that this is not the current account balance, is a part of this, yes, but it's the most relevant part, let's say, the trade of goods and services. And that if you generate actually revenue to pay other services, yes. So the sign is positive, showing that when you have a surplus in this trade, this surplus is correlated with a higher exchange rate. And this supports our hypothesis that Bresser presented to you, that a negative current account or a deficit current account is correlated to overvaluation of exchange rates. Okay, and we estimate this graph shows the relation between the misalignment. Okay, the misalignment is the red line. Yes, Thiago? Yes, and the blue line is the results of the current account, okay, the current account balance. And then we can see that they are strongly correlated for the period that was analyzed since 2000, beginning 2000 until 2019. Yes, exactly. So in these 4 countries, you can see that there is a strong correlation between the results. So for us, it was interesting to show that because you get to prove or to try to prove, okay, the ideas that Bresser presented to you about the correlation among this current account balance and the exchange rate, okay, and showing there is a strong correlation, surely, and that since we are saying that this variable, a log of trade of goods and services is explanatory variable, so it is determining the exchange rate, okay, and then we can try to show that really the exchange, the trade balance could be a choice of economic policy. Okay, this obviously you are doing this comment, okay, or this conclusion based on our theory, okay, that the current account balance is a choice of economic policy, and then it results in a specific behavior for the exchange rate. Yes. So this is one of the prices that are relevant for us. But you know that, as Bresser said, that if a country suffers a Dutch disease process, the industrial equilibrium exchange rate will be distinct from the one that guarantees the current account equilibrium. Okay, so when you have a Dutch disease, when there is no Dutch disease, the exchange rate equilibrium, the equilibrium exchange rate is the same. Okay, for the country to be the manufacturing to be competitive, to equilibrate the current account. When there is Dutch disease, those exchange rates are distinct. Okay. And the industrial equilibrium exchange rate becomes relevant to because the manufacturing has a lower profit rate than the other sectors or primary sectors, so he needs another exchange rate to be competitive in this case. And this is why I said to you in the beginning that the wrong prices are relevant for some sectors, okay? Because in this case that we have, for example, Dutch disease, the profit margin of primary sectors is higher, and the exchange rate valuation, the high interest rates affect much more less intensely the primary sectors than the manufacturing. So, and what is the industrial equilibrium exchange rate? Bresser said that I suppose that you read lots of times what you said. What you explain about that is the exchange rate that compensates, to be really to summarize, okay, very briefly, is the one that compensates differentials among unit labor costs. How does that know? Compensates differentials among unit labor costs for, this is not among, again, is of competing nations in the global trade. I said nations because Robert Wade likes to say nations, not countries, and he's correct. We were discussing about that yesterday. And then the industrial equilibrium exchange rate has the target of compensating these costs, okay? This difference in labor unit costs. Here I brought a graph that shows the 3 different exchange rates. So the blue one is industrial equilibrium exchange rate, okay, that we estimate based on this criteria of difference among unit labor costs, okay. This series starts on 2000 and goes until 2018. Then I will present in the next graph the most recent data, okay. The orange one is I'm not sure. Okay, yeah, exactly, sorry. Is the current account equilibrium exchange rates, okay? Is an index, okay, of, we didn't estimate actually a value for this industrial equilibrium exchange rate because the fundamentals, the way that we estimate the models, Eliane said to us, and she is correct, so you cannot say a specific value, yes, for this series, so you just estimate an index, but not a value in reais. And the gray one is the series of the real effective exchange rates, okay? And we can say that in the first period, this period before 2005, the real exchange rate, effective exchange rate was higher than the industrial, higher than the the current account equilibrium exchange rates. So the situation inverted before 2005, and after this period, we can say a large period of appreciation, okay, of the real exchange rate, because for the whole period, this real exchange rate is lower than the industrial equilibrium exchange rate. In some periods, for a few periods between 2015, 2000 to 2007, it was larger, the current account equilibrium exchange rate, but it's for a real small period, so it's not enough to re-equilibrate, to make this balance positive, okay, of current account. So, in this graph, we are showing the industrial equilibrium exchange rate that we just have estimated. Thiago finished estimated this week to get the more recent data. The most difficult data to estimate this exchange rate is Chinese data and sometimes Korean data also, yes. But we can say that from 2005 up to now, until the second quarter of 2022, in the most of the period, we had a real exchange rate that was evaluated based on this criteria. Okay, the misalignment was negative, we can say that, and then it becomes positive after 2020. So, but why this period? Okay, so you can say to me, but before 2020, there is a positive misalignment, or you can say the real exchange rate is higher than the industrial equilibrium exchange rate, and why does it didn't affect positively the exports and negatively imports, for example? Yes. So the problem is that, okay, there are lots of explanations for that. The first one is that this period of the appreciation was too large. Okay, it was about, based on our criteria, more or less 14, 15 years. So it's difficult to the entrepreneurships and the firms, they adopt exactly strategies to confront this situation, okay, to face this situation. Then they start to import much more inputs, and they are, when the depreciation happened, they changed this mix of inputs in his production. So they will not revert this from suddenly, okay? The second point is that the pandemic will reduce our exports, yes, for China and for also other countries. So they reduce imports. So actually, we also reduce exports. And the third factor is that is the economic situation, okay, and the perspective of the Brazilian economy is not fine, okay. We know everybody knows that we are defronting a very bad economic situation. The instability for investments too large, so nobody will invest or try to export on this situation. And the fourth, that is too relevant also, is that who believes that this exchange rate will stay in this level for the next year? If I were an entrepreneurship, I won't believe on that, okay? So we are not sure about that, okay? Not only the volatility, but the level, okay? We don't know if you come to stay. So this is why, this is my explanation for the fact that this devaluation didn't provoke a large effect on exports. But we need to consider that if you look for the quantum of manufacturing exports, it has increased. Not too much in Brazil, but it has improved a little, yes? So it's not just this factor, but it must be affected by this depreciation. So regarding the value, okay, so we estimated that the value of this exchange rate nowadays, the industrial equilibrium exchange rate, is 4.72. Okay, regarding to the data that we just estimated, it's surely that this is not an exact value because it's around that. So we estimated this based on the comparison between unit labor costs. Okay, we know that this is an estimation. Okay. But anyway, it's not too large. It's not it's not much more than this for us. Why? Okay, because we cannot. We discussed it with Damian in a class last term, and he gave me. I need to say thank you for him because he gave me a good explanation. So exchange rate is not the exchange rate doesn't have the aim or the target to compensate all inefficiencies of Brazilian economy. So I cannot put in the exchange rate the problems of infrastructure, the problems of taxes, the problem of cheese, okay, lots of problems. So we are just estimating an exchange rate that compensates unit labor costs. Yes? And this is the level to to compensate it. If I include in the exchange rate all the problems that Brazilian economy suffers, so possibly the exchange rate will be, I don't know how much, okay? I don't estimate this, but it could be 8, 10, I don't know. But surely this, if the exchange rate would be so high, the problem will be the inflationary process. Is that there is another problem, huge problem for Brazilian economy. So we cannot use exchange rate to compensate for all problems that you face, okay? This is why you estimate this. So something around 4, 5, 75, or if you can use an interval and you define it, maybe 5 or something like that. It's the exchange rate should be in this interval. Okay. Let's talk about the other price. The second price that we want to talk about this, to define, at least theoretically, is the interest rate. What will be the interest rate? Bresser told to you. The equilibrium interest rate must be equivalent to the external interest rate in the most relevant competing nations plus the country risk, for example, the MMBI index, okay? And we are discussing too much about what would be this interest rate. Maybe it's the interest rate for investment. Maybe you must compare the difference between the profit rate and the interest rate, okay? And then compare this difference with other countries. But we also talked to some entrepreneurships in Brazil, and they told us that there are not micro entrepreneurships, but they actually manage large entrepreneurships of machines and capital goods. And they said that they use lots of own capital to invest because the interest rate in Brazil is too high, okay? Because there is no more lines in BNDES, okay, related to investment, so they use lots of own capital to invest. And they said, I think the most relevant interest rate is to compare, actually, if you use our own capital to invest, so what we can compare? We can compare the return of investment with the return of financial applications. How do you say that? Financial in general, financial activities, yes? So then we decide to use this like a opportunity costs. But what is this opportunity cost, okay? So you can use maybe this possibility, okay, of this basic interest rate, okay, because it's the rate that guides the treasury bonds. Maybe the lending rate, okay, but because you can compare this with other countries. There is a large series of World Banks, so we are discussing this. But the principle is that, okay, that we make a kind of opportunity cost, and the opportunity cost would be to make investments, financial investments here in Brazil, or financial applications here, or in other countries, okay? So inflation, okay, you also think about inflation. You also said, so you must have a reasonable, a good inflation. But what is a good inflation, okay? So first of all, we defined that it was important to think in a inflation observed in developing countries, okay, in developing economies. Why? Because in general, these countries must catching up. Yes, if they need to catch up, they need to consider the relation between inflation and growth. Okay, not only inflation, but in the target or the central bank target, the central bank must combine, okay, inflation and growth, because growth is important to make this process. So this is why we decided to look for inflation in developing countries to be what will be our inflation. Must be similar to what is observed in other developing countries. One possible way to estimate this is the adoption of a model like the model that Danny Hodrick adopted to estimate the undervaluation of exchange rates. So he estimated what is the relation between undervaluation, between the exchange rate and growth. And then he made estimate these parameters, and he estimates the misalignment in that case of the exchange rates, comparing the observed exchange rate and the exchange rate that was estimated by the model, and the model considered growth. So we are thinking doing the same. We are thinking in estimating the correlation between inflation and growth to get the parameters to estimate the inflation that would be compatible with the observable growth of our economy, and then to compare with the effective or the observed growth, inflation. Okay, to estimate the misalignment between the inflation observed and the inflation that is estimated, or that would be fine for the country. But we are thinking in doing a model like this. Okay. The fourth price is the profit rate. Okay, the profit rate must be similar to other profit rates observed in the most relevant competing nations. This is the profit rate at actually all these macro prices. They are related to each other, so it's difficult to say. So, Bresser, we are discussing. So you must define each price separately. Okay. But obviously, so all of these macro prices, they interfere in each other. So there are a huge endogeneity, let's say that, between those prices. Yes, but we try to define this price separately, and in this case of the profit rate, it's strongly influenced by the others. Okay, but I brought the definition of the exchange of the profit rate here because this definition is actually a definition for firm's profit rate. It's not a macro profit rate. So my problem nowadays is to transform this equation in a more macro level. And what is include this profit rate, that is this P, is equal to 1 minus unit labor costs plus the share of imported products, the price, okay. Yes, exactly. Is the share of the, let me remember, this is the cost, this is the revenue, exactly. So this is the share of imported prices, okay, in the production times the exchange rate, plus the share of domestic inputs in the production, okay? Divided by the revenue. The revenue is a combination of the price that is practiced in the domestic market and the price that is of the goods that are exported, considering surely the share of each domestic and exports in total revenue, okay? And this is multiplied by the capital productivity. Capital productivity is a relevant variable to define both the profit rate, and then you see in the next chart, it's also relevant to define the wage rate, the equilibrium wage rate. So I know that this variable is not easy to estimate, or some database estimated, but theoretically it's very important to look for the capital productivity to observe the behavior of the profit rate, and also I'll show to you in the next chart, to estimate what is the wage rate that the economy can practice without generate too much inflation and contributing to the income distribution. Okay, so let's talk about this price that I think is the most conflicting macroeconomic price. I said that, okay, that it's the most difficult, and then it's more it's the price that suffers more and more discussion and most controversial, let's say that, in the discussion. Yes, but we know that this price is a very conflicting price, because when because by one side, okay, while it pushes aggregate demand, increases well-being, it is also cost for enterprise. Okay, so the first principle of this wage rate is that, in terms of equilibrium, right, that wage growth, or the wage growth rate must follow productivity increases. Yes, this is the general rule for this. But when you say that it is, we discuss sometimes in our group about this, is that if wage will follow specifically the productivity increase and just the productivity increase, what happened? The wage share in the economy will not change. Okay, so it's like to say if the wages will increase only based on productivity increases, say the wage share is determined and the wages cannot, the share of wages in income cannot grow. But for a progressist economist, let's say that, okay, we must be worried about this question, okay? You must try to solve this problem. Otherwise, we will not have a functional income distribution in the economy. So we propose a rule that allows for such increases, okay? Which increases? The increases in the wage share, okay? But this rule has a constraint, okay? Okay, there is an S here, a constraint, okay? The necessary level of profit to compete with other nations in the global market. So there is a large constraint to increase the wages. Which is the constraint? The constraint is that Bresser said, also the most relevant variable to compete or to show the competitiveness of a country or an enterprise is the profit rate. Okay, the profit rate must be the necessary to enterprise to invest and so on. So, how do you try to solve this problem? Okay, first of all, we bring this definition. Okay, that's not our definition; it's a basic definition that the P is profit, K is capital. So this is the profit rate. The profit rate is is equivalent to the participation of profits in income, okay, the profit share, times the capital productivity. This is why I said to you that capital productivity is relevant for this definition of profits and also wages, okay? So, and then in this part of the equation, I just took this share profit shares, and then I make this equal to 1 minus the wage share and the tax share, so the participation of imposts in income, times the capital productivity. So if we consider this tax, the participation of tax on income is not equal to 0, you know, okay? But just to simplify our explanation, okay, we can have 1 minus the wage share times capital productivity. What will happen? So if you want to increase this wage share, okay, we must consider that we have a limit that is given by this a minimum profit rate that the enterprise must receive, okay, and given the behavior of the capital productivity. So it's possible that if you increase the capital productivity, if the economy increases the capital productivity, we can increase also the wage share, and the profit rate can be constant, for example. So this is a way to increase the wage share, okay, without causing too much first, okay, we will not cause reduction, a huge reduction or a reasonable reduction in profit rate, but we can also maybe don't have too many impacts on inflation. Why? Because if you think inflation as a result of a distributive conflict, so when the profit rate will be kept reasonable or satisfactory for the entrepreneurships, so we can increase this wage share, okay? And this wage share in macroeconomics terms we must remember is the unit labor costs. Okay, not in the firm level, but in the macroeconomic terms, is the unit labor cost. So we can say that we can increase the unit labor costs, and there is no impact on inflation. Not no impact, but a moderate impact on inflation. And it can keep the profit rate stable. My problem now with this model is that so if you increase the unit labor costs, it also increases the industrial equilibrium exchange rate, obviously, because as I defined it to you. So I think how to solve this problem. I need to consider the capital productivity in the definition of the industrial equilibrium exchange rate. I haven't done it yet. I'm thinking if it's reasonable to consider that. And that equation of profit rate is a firm level equation, okay? And the other equations are macro prices, so I need to also transform this profit rate. So this is a way we are trying with these definitions, okay, to establish which are these macroeconomic prices that you said all the time that must be in the equilibrium level. Bresser said here about these macro prices. He criticizes the article of Thomas Paley. I say that I know that Oreiro also answered that paper, but the problem is that Thomas Paley was thinking that we are discussing the right equilibrium in the sense of the market equilibrium prices. As I said in the beginning of the presentation for you, right prices, what we are calling by right prices, are what the traditional theory calls wrong prices. Yes, because they are managed, they are at least followed by the government. Okay, and what we are trying to do to show to you which will be these right prices for our theory, that is not neoclassical equilibrium, or okay, is our market equilibrium, is the right level that could improve the development of the countries. Okay, so why they are necessary? I am just reinforcing that because some sectors have different profit rates, and in general, in our economy and other developing countries, the primary sectors have higher profit rates than the more complex sectors. So if you practice macroeconomic prices, leaving the definition for the market, what will happen? The interest rates will be higher, the exchange rate will probably be more overvalued by the explanation of Bresser, okay? And then these more complex sectors will be harmed by the market equilibrium prices. So you need to manage this price to get the necessary level, and then to improve the investment in these sectors, more complex sectors. Okay, okay. It was that. I think you understand, and I'm open to comments and suggestions because, as I said to you, this is a work in progress. Thank you.
Thank you. Nelson, I was thinking on, should we get out? Well, I was thinking about something that I have in mind very frequently, which is the credit conditions for the economy, which is not in many models that say kind of abstract from credit conditions. And it came to me something for your consideration in this model, which is maybe another way, or actually another source of how is it possible to maintain an attractive profit rate while gradually increasing the share of wages in the economy, in income, total income, which is to put in the model the share of income which is received by financial rentiers. Because I was thinking about interest rates, and also on the discussions in the Economic Council of São Paulo State Industry Federation, which I used to attend. And interest rates are very relevant. But interest rates, in a way, can be seen as a way of transferring income from the productive sectors, which normally are borrowers, to the rentiers, or say, owners of financial wealth, which normally are the creditors. So if we have lower interest rates, that share of GDP or income, which the whole society must pay for rentiers, and so the whole society, including the productive sector, should pay a share of it out of their profits. You could increase profits not at the expense of wages, but you could increase profits at the expense of the wealth owners' income. And this is very relevant when we talk about very high interest rates as we have in Brazil.
Yeah.
Maybe
Yes.
5% of GDP.
Yeah.
That could be 20% of profits, 30% of profits, 25% of profits. So this also is a way, because when we talk about productivity,
For example, here.
yes, so there's another thing, that's because it's not only, many models use it, it's not a fault of this model, use wages and profits as the division of income. But in reality, there's not only wages and income. There are other rents, real estate rents, financial assets rents, and all this must be paid by whatever is the income that a society produces in 1 year.
Yes.
So,
Oh, thanks for your suggestion, Damian. And I'm trying to simplify exactly. I consider wages and taxes, looking for the national accounts, but it's also another source of destination of income. Yes, the rents. Yes. So we can include maybe looking for this and then making the link with the interest rate there, the price of the interest rate. Yes. Because if you reduce the interest rates, probably the income will reduce here. For rentiers, yes. Okay.
for profits.
Yes, exactly. Okay, thank you.
Nelson, congratulations for your presentation. It was very interesting. I would like to make a comment. I don't know if it is fair because we discussed this idea before, but regarding to the inflation equilibrium, I was thinking that I don't know if it is the same methodology of Danny Roderick, because the idea of Danny Roderick is to correct the exchange rate by the Balassa-Samuelson effect. So what is the idea behind this concept that he is trying to estimate? As the productivity in tradable goods is higher than the productivities in no tradable goods, the price of tradable will be small than the price of the non-tradable, so the exchange rate will decrease, will appreciate as the GDP per capita grows. But in the case of inflation, the idea of correct by GDP growth, I was confused about this idea.
Sorry.
What is the idea behind?
I
because
didn't explain well. Sorry. Yes, you are sure. I'm not trying to. We are not trying to correct. We are trying to just to check the relationship among inflation and growth. Okay, it's a simple regression to look for this relation, and then we estimate this parameter of growth. Okay, and then you can say, okay, for example, let's say that the Brazilian economy grows 1%. Okay, if you using the parameter of the equation and use the fact that the Brazilian economic growth was 1%, what would be the inflation given the parameters of this equation that relates inflation and growth? What will be the inflation rate that is correspondent to this 1% growth given this equation? this parameter, okay? So this is what we discussed, okay? And I'm sorry, I was just remember that Roderick makes this, Dennis make this correlation between exchange rate and growth first to estimate the balance summers, but it's not this, it's not the same.
Okay,
fact.
as you said, that was the same of Danny Roderick. I was worried about it, but it's okay.
Yes,
Thank
exactly.
you. Sorry.
No, thanks for correcting me because you are working together on this. So, and this is important correction because of the people will think that it's the same methodology. We are just establishing the relationship between inflation and growth.
Hi, Professor. Thank you for the presentation. Very nice. My question is regarding the profit rate. You mentioned that sometimes in some sectors, that could be a profit rate different from others. So my question is, how would you manage those prices upwards or downwards? Let's imagine that we have a sector like the primary sector with very high profit rate. How would you do this to become less profitable? And how could you, let's say, semiconductor sectors, sectors that we know that we are far behind in technology development, so we don't have profit rates yet, let's say. How can you push the sector to have a profit rate since we don't? Is it a only state-managed sector, would you say?
Okay. This is an important point to you that you emphasize because I need to explain it better. As I said, okay, the profit rate actually is a result of the other prices, yes? So we don't have how to manage directly this price, yes? So it will be very a huge intervention, let's say that, okay? You say, no, the profit rate in this sector must be that. But we have on this equation of profit rate, we have the unit labor costs that is related to the wage rate. We have the exchange rate that is related to the exchange rate that you said. Okay, we haven't included here the tax, okay, but maybe you could include here to make it more complete, and even financial costs. So we can improve this equation, okay? And in this sense, this price, interest prices, wage rates, interest rate, wage rates, and exchange rate, we can manage more closely, yes, as a government. And then we will result in a certain inflation and also a profit rate. So to be more rigorous, I would say that the three prices that you can manage more closely in this model are the interest rates, the exchange rates, and the wage rates as a policy, okay? Thinking in policy, in possible tools, okay, that you can control to make economic policy. And the other two rates, profit and inflation, are much more a result of this, not only this, but influenced by these rates. Yes, this is important to also to quote. Okay. Anybody else? No. Okay. 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 Thank you for your attention, for your audience, and we now we started later, but we started. Let me see. Yes, we started early. Good, good. We finished. Oh, sorry, we finished early. And so for everybody, we have a lunchtime now. Unfortunately, you cannot offer a lunch for you or a free lunch because our resources are scarce. There's no free lunch, exactly. and the restaurant of this floor, we try to negotiate for everybody to have lunch there, but there are no space for everybody. So you can have lunch at the first floor, yes, if you don't mind. There is another restaurant. It's the same food. Okay, the difference that you need to weight your dish. Yes, it's like per kilo. Is okay, but it's the same food. You go there, and then you have lunch there. Or if you wanna go out to have lunch another place, it's free for you. Yeah, yes.